Okay, should we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. I am Mario Macis. I'm a professor of economics at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School, and also a member of the leadership team at HBHI, the Hopkins Business of Health Initiative. Welcome to our webinar, which is part of HBHI's webinar series, Conversations on the Business of Health. Today we'll go for an hour until 2 p.m. We will leave some time at the end to address questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions. I will be monitoring that. You may ask a general question, but you can also indicate who the question is for. Today I have the pleasure of co-hosting this webinar with Cathy McDonald, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Health Systems, Quality and Safety at Johns Hopkins, the School of Nursing and the School of Medicine, and also a member of HBHI's leadership team. Hello, Cathy.
Hi, everybody.
Today's topic is challenges and opportunities in the market for blood and blood components. I will make a quick introduction of the topic, but first I want to introduce and welcome our panelists. We're very happy and grateful to have Curt Bailey, who is President and CEO of BloodWorks Northwest, Meghan Delaney, who is Chief of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, and also the Director of Transfusion Medicine at Children's National Hospital. She's also a professor in the Departments of Pathology and Pediatrics at George Washington University. Joshua Penrod, who is Senior Vice President and Head of Global Plasma and Technical Advocacy at PPTA, the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association. And Paul Sullivan, who is Senior Vice President of Donor Services at the American Red Cross. Welcome to all of you. Again, thank you for accepting our invitation. We're super grateful and excited to have this conversation with you about this very important topic. There is a constant need for blood in the US and everywhere around the world, driven by persistent medical needs. So this underscores the critical role that blood and blood components, such as plasma, platelets, play in healthcare. Recent data from America's blood centers indicate that in the US, every 2 seconds, someone receives a blood transfusion. Blood is critical during medical emergencies when its immediate availability can really be a life or death matter, but uses of blood and blood components go way beyond emergencies. Blood is today an integral part of more routine medical procedures like surgeries, cancer treatments, and managing several chronic illnesses. Over a fourth of the US blood inventory, for example, is used by cancer patients. And blood components such as plasma similarly play a critical role in maintaining health and treating disease. So far, at least, there is no substitute for human blood. We can talk about this later, about possible substitutes in the future, but so far, there is no substitute, and the large and persistent demand must be met by a robust and stable supply provided by people, by blood donors. Now, the blood industry in the US is complex and is characterized by multiple markets, each with its peculiarities. There is the market for whole blood, there are markets for blood components, and then there's a market for donors of blood and blood components. The market for whole blood tends to have a relatively strong regional or local component, whereas the market for plasma operates at a much larger scale. There is, in fact, a global market for plasma. And perhaps a not very well-known fact outside of the industry is that the United States is a big exporter of plasma and plasma products. So these markets are intertwined and they operate in a complex ecosystem. The goal of this webinar today is to discuss these multiple markets and within the blood industry in the US, its structure and the challenges that these markets face. Our panelists represent a diverse group of leaders in the blood and plasma industry. They have extensive expertise in blood donation, transfusion medicine, plasma protein, therapeutics, and they will bring valuable insights into these markets and the challenges that are facing the industry. The goal is to provide our audience with a comprehensive overview of the blood industry and sort of foster a discussion on the steps that can be taken to ensure a stable supply of blood and blood components for patients in need. So I'd like to begin with a first round of contributions from our panelists. I'm going to pose like a broad question to each of them. What is your assessment of the current state of the market for blood and blood components in the US? What do you see as the major challenges in general, and perhaps more importantly, from the point of view of your specific segment of the industry? I propose to begin with Dr. Delaney, or Meghan, if I may, as someone who, as the director of transfusion medicine at a major hospital, is more on the demand side of the industry. What is the state of the blood industry, Meghan, in the US from your point of view? What do you see as the major challenges that we currently face?
Well, thank you. And thanks, Mario, for explaining things so well to start us off. So there's, and you were absolutely correct in saying how many different types of therapies are in our medical system are dependent on blood transfusion. Cancer care, elective surgery are very big major users of blood, whereas also things that what you think of when you need to save your life, such as being in a car accident or some sort of traumatic injury as well. So we need blood both in this ongoing big amount to sustain the therapies of hospitalized patients and patients with cancer and blood disorders. And then we also need emergency stocks to always be able to have enough for the patient who comes to our door with a gunshot wound or a car accident or some sort of trauma. So in the US, we tend to usually have enough, but that depends on product and region. And I think we'll probably talk about that. But when I think about overall the status of the market, financially speaking, I would say the word that comes to mind is unsustainable. And, you know, I say that from the hospital's perspective. My hospital both purchases blood from a blood supplier. And we're also kind of unique in that we have our own mini blood supplier inside my hospital that I run. So we collect donor blood and we process it ourselves. And then we also, that's about half of what we need for our patients. And then the other half we buy. However, when you do just sort of dollar for dollar based on what generally CMS is saying is reimbursed, and that's the easiest way to look at it. Although I will say as a pediatric hospital, we are predominantly Medicaid, not Medicare. And that's, you know, each state is different. But if you just look at the CMS number and you look at about what it costs to purchase or procure ourselves, the hospital loses money on every single unit that's transfused, give or take. And that's why I say from a hospital's perspective, it's unsustainable. And, you know, I'm very interested to hear what the blood centers say, because it might be unsustainable for different reasons, but because as you know, healthcare continues to increase, how much is paid for these services has not kept up.
Thank you. That was super interesting. Curt, would you like to go next?
Well, you know, starting in 2009, the volume of transfused components, at least for red cells, started to decline. And at that point, you know, we had a pretty big positive difference between the amount that was used and the amount we collected in the country. So we were collecting a lot more than was required. That was essentially an inventory buffer. Well, since then, the volumes transfused declined, at least up until the pandemic, and the volume collected also declined, but at a faster rate. And so today, those two lines, if you envision them as time series, have converged. So what left the system? The inventory. And that's why we experience the kinds of shortages that Dr. Delaney mentioned. And it is variable over time, you know, seasonal or by events. It does vary by blood type or component type, for sure. During the same period, or roughly the same period, the number of active blood donors in the United States contracted in every age band under age 60. And at the same time, the real dollar price for blood between 2004 and 2020-ish, the real dollar price declined by about 25%. And we had this consolidation in the industry. We had price reductions in nominal and real dollar terms to the hospitals. And in my opinion, what we didn't do is we didn't invest back in the donor base. And that's why today, at least as we see it in the national data, and as we see it in our local experience, there's just not enough blood donors. And the root cause is we haven't been putting money into the recruitment of donors over the last several years. And now that those two lines have converged and there's no slack in the system, we have shortage. As a point of fact, in the state of Washington, we calculated the adjusted cost per inpatient day. It's around $3,900. The proportion of that you would attribute to blood on average across all inpatient days would be $13. That's the cost of 4 hours of parking. So we don't actually think this is an affordability problem for the national healthcare system, maybe for labs, maybe for certain hospitals, but in aggregate, blood is a very small amount of the national healthcare expenditures.
Thank you, Curt. Paul?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for letting me participate, and I've appreciated Meghan's and Curt's comments. I'm just building a little bit on Curt's comments, right? I think it is interesting, right? Your comments, Curt, about the decline in the size of the buffer, right? I think that's real, right? We've driven a lot of cost out of the industry to, I think, meet hospital needs, and I do think the challenge we face collectively, right, is the declining donor base, or just simply the size of the donor base. I mean, maybe to add a little bit, in the more recent history is, we saw in COVID, kind of initial first couple of weeks, very challenged to get donors out. The White House issued a statement about the importance of blood donation. We saw a surge in donors. Blood and plasma came along, another surge in donors. But even with all of that, if you go back to 2019 until today, the donor base for the Red Cross, and I'll just speak to the Red Cross, we're down about 12%, right, which is a pretty significant decline in a relatively short time. Now, we've been able to make up for that, and so we're actually producing more product now than we were then, but by frequency. But it's an interesting trend that we're seeing fewer people participate, and we're asking more of them, or they are giving us more. And I think it really is a combination of both, right? So some of that is good, right? There's a real pressure in the industry, appropriately so, to make sure that we are very focused on type-specific collections. I mean, it really just is very hospital service, patient service focused. And so, the challenges I think we face are making sure that we can meet demand in a cost-effective way by having enough donors, but really trying to be as precise as possible in terms of getting the right products in from the right communities so that we minimize waste, which is always a priority, and then obviously maximize patient impact and in turn hospital satisfaction. So I do agree with the fact that one of our real challenges is how we expand the donor base going forward. I think that has to be a priority for the industry in terms of the long-term health. And I think we'll get to it later. I think the real key to that also is, we've seen a disparate fall off in the participation in some communities of color, and we need to really make sure that we're doing sufficient outreach and inclusion efforts to make sure that we bring those donors back in, because they also declined since the beginning of COVID.
Yeah, this is it's obviously an extremely important question on how to correct this imbalance between demand and supply. Josh, I'd like to hear your contribution now, but first, a balance, an imbalance between demand and supply was mentioned in the context of whole blood, but I don't think that's the case from what I understand in the plasma industry. But before we, I'd like your comments on that too, but before, I'd like for you to tell our audience a little bit about the plasma industry and its importance. And I don't want to assume that our audience necessarily is familiar with the details. So Thanks.
Sure. No, Mario, and thank you for pointing that out. And I think the way you group the question and the responses to it is kind of instructive. The plasma industry, and whenever I talk about plasma, I'm specifically referring to what's called in the US anyway as source plasma. And that's plasma that's used for further manufacture into what are called fractionated plasma products. These products are used for a variety of generally rare and extremely serious conditions. Our industry is a little bit different from what the transfusion community experiences because the plasma that is collected for us is used specifically as a raw material for further manufacture. It's not directly transfused into recipients. And so it's a distinct type of biological product manufacturing that is, pretty night and day from what our transfusion colleagues on this panel have to deal with every day. That being said, certainly our industry had its share of challenges with COVID as well. We had about a 20% drop in donations in 2020 and going into 2021. And I think one of the noted aspects anyway of the differences between plasma donation and blood donation, plasma donation, you're hooked up to an automatic machine called a pheresis device that separates the blood components that are returned to the donor, and then the plasma is kept as in its own separate container for further usage, for further manufacture. So it's a fundamentally different process, and so it can take a donor well over an hour to donate a unit of plasma. And so for that reason, we do compensate our donors. And I think one of the things that had been kind of the I don't know, spoken or unspoken conventional wisdom for a long period of time was that, our industry never had to do anything because our donors were compensated. But we have found that that's really not the case. We have to promote and generate awareness of the importance of plasma donation as well. It's not an easy, certainly not an easy task to build a donor population. Our industry is predicated on repeat donors because we do return the cellular components to donors. Plasma donors can donate more often. There's a theoretical maximum of 104 times per year in the United States. That virtually never happens. Our donor frequency is usually somewhere between 20 and 30 times per year. But so the necessity of the repeat donation and high volumes of plasma to be used in further manufacture is driven in large part by the concentration of proteins in the plasma that are extracted and used for treatments for conditions such as bleeding disorders, primary immune deficiencies, sets of neurological conditions, alpha-1 antitrypsin disorder, things like this, where you have very, very small patient populations supported by a very, very large number of donors in comparison. We have somewhere around, on any given snapshot of a year, probably around 2 million plasma donors in the US. So there are some similarities and some differences to what the blood community, I think, has experienced. And certainly, the world is different now after COVID, I think, for everybody. And I totally agree with what Paul and others have said about the bounce that occurred with regard to awareness during the midst of the peak of the pandemic, as it were. Finding a sustainable solution to that, though, has not been easy. I think some firms have cottoned on to a few things and some others, but the other aspect of it too is the vulnerability of the patient groups that we serve, because these are individuals that have very, very serious conditions. And for example, someone with a primary immune disorder, COVID was not a good thing for anybody, but it's especially pernicious for someone with a troubled immune system. So so we have seen the struggles basically from donor through to patient. In kind of, I guess, reacting to or adjusting for some of the challenges and headwinds that I think we've all experienced in COVID, and certainly even in the years leading up to it. Is that responsive, Mario? Is that the?
Thank you. It's great.
Yeah. a lot's been said here that's already just piquing, I think, everybody's curiosity. Since we've been talking a little bit more about the donor side, I'd like to extend that conversation and have any of your reactions to ways that the barriers that exist for, gaining either more donors or more frequent donors, how those are being overcome. So what, beyond the barriers that you've been talking about, what other barriers to donation could potentially be eliminated? Such as, we're aware that the FDA proposed to eliminate the existing time-based blood donation deferrals for men who have sex with men. That would be, one strategy of gaining a larger share of potential donors who hadn't previously been allowed to donate. Do you, as you're working in your various domains, what strategies are you seeing working better to recruit and retain blood donors, particularly in underserved communities? And what strategies do you see on the horizon? And maybe Curt, could we start with you on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Our survey research of donors and non-donors alike, of donors for plasma as well as for transfusible components, it's very consistent that convenience matters more than almost any other thing. And convenience in the modern world, now includes their digital experience, because a substantial part now of the blood donation experience actually occurs on your phone or on your PC as you're arranging your appointment, learning more about it, figuring out where to go, doing the donor history questionnaire, and so on. And then you have to actually go and donate, blood, and that takes time, and time's really valuable for people. And if we don't compress that time, and we don't make that as simple as possible to complete, all the way from the moment somebody thinks maybe I should donate or I'd like to donate, all the way to the point where they, we hope, schedule their next appointment, then you just don't get the uptake you need. And so we kind of stress the first priority is convenience, the second priority is convenience, and the third priority is convenience. And that's what we're focusing on above all else.
Interesting. I'm curious, Meghan, if there's anything so generally speaking here too, but if there's anything about working in an environment where you have both the recipients and the donors, is there anything that where you work both of those angles together in some way?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. Yeah. So I will say I'm thrilled to work at a hospital that has a donor center. And it's for two main reasons. One is that with the fluctuations in availability of products, it's an insurance policy. It helps me feel like I'm going to be able to get the products. And I ask our employees to donate, right? So I have somewhat of a captive audience. The other captive audience I have are the families coming to visit the patients in my hospital. Oh, the connection to the patient is quite close when you're standing, especially in a pediatric hospital, to say that blood's going to these babies in this building. So I definitely am grateful for that, because I think it is important for what pulls some people in to donate. I also want to describe, and I think the blood center colleagues here also probably have programs like this. At our donor center, we have what we call a buddy program. And so we have one of the largest pediatric sickle cell disease programs in the country. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we take care of children who need chronic red cell transfusion for their whole lives, unless they can have one of the new stem cell therapies or a stem cell transplant to eventually cure the sickle cell disease. We perform those transplants as well. But the buddy program is for donors who have the blood types that match they get specially matched blood. We give them a card, and it's a special card. You're part of the Transfusion Buddy program. And we actually, when those units come into our donor center, we tag them to our patients that are also, so they have shared ancestry. And so blood groups are genetic. And so those are more likely to align, and we make sure they all align at all the different blood group points. But that has really helped us. And we really engage the African-American community in Washington, D.C., Howard universities across the road from us, and we work with the fraternities and sororities. So we do that. And I think that, again, the presence of the patients being so close really does help. And I know that the program I'm describing is not unique. There's a lot of places that do things like that.
Interesting. And I know Curt had mentioned something about the different age bands in terms of donations. Josh, on the plasma side, are there different groups that you have a harder time reaching? You mentioned, that people can donate a lot more than they actually do, although 20 times a year is a lot. What are you thinking about in terms of strategies to keep the supply to what you'd like it to be?
Yeah, well, it's not up to me in terms of what I would like to see, of course, but I think it is important to note that the biggest constraint is, of course, plasma availability. And that continues to be so even for our industry. And it's also important to recognize that in any given plasma collection, you have to have a certain amount of types of proteins that come out that can be used in different products. Otherwise, it's not economically sustainable for our industry either. So even though right now, immunoglobulin is and has been the primary driver for our industry for more than a decade now, our PPTA member companies still need to be able to place the clotting factor and the albumin and all of the other proteins that get used in different products all over the world. So there's a constraint there. I think that there are a couple of different facets to that question, Kathy. The notable one, I think, overall, are some changes that I've witnessed in the industry since I'm now, as I was expressing to a board member of mine, and she was commiserating with me the other day, we're now the old guard. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago whenever we were the new kids coming into the industry, but it's amazing how fast time can catch up with you and sometimes pass you by. But plasma centers today are far different than what they were years ago, even a handful of years ago. Companies do try to make the environment as inviting and warm as possible. Most of them, if not all of them, now have Wi-Fi connectivity for donors. A lot of plasma centers have daycare alternatives for busy single moms or working moms who come in with their kid. Gives them an opportunity to donate. Now that's sort of the macro view. The micro view is that every plasma center reflects the community in which it's located. Our voluntary standards, the IQPP program, is set up in a way that requires donors to show a permanent address within a certain degree of proximity to the plasma center. So the people who are donating in plasma centers are people from the community as well. So if there's something going on in a specific area that that can affect donor availability or awareness or anything like that, we have those same constraints. And I think I had been musing about this more recently, and that's probably just because I've been a bit slow on the uptake for this, and I'm sure Paul, Curt, and Meghan are much more aware of this than I am. But one of the things that is, I've been toying with in my mind, and I haven't come up with a solution for it really, is the fear of needles. There's a significant portion of the population that refuses to get a blood draw for their own wellness checkup. So if anywhere between, I've seen estimates from 17 to 30% of young adults have a fear of needles so much that it either dissuades them from either giving a blood sample or certainly from donating blood or plasma. That really knocks a huge chunk of the eligible population out of the equation. Back to the original core of your question, our donors do tend to skew a little bit younger than the blood communities, at least in the data that I'm familiar with. I can't speak to, I don't have expertise in the way Paul and Meghan and Curt do. But it's not as young perhaps as what you might think, but it does skew a little bit younger. And we we have said many times throughout my time at PPTA anyway, that we encourage donation in all of its forms, whether it's blood, whether it's plasma, something like that, just in an effort to help procure awareness across the board, given the importance of blood donation. And we were very well aware of some of the trends that Curt and Paul were talking about earlier, with regard to changes in demand and certainly shrinking donor base. We had watched that, and I have to say that we were watching it with some grave concern, because we're patients too, whenever it comes to the blood community. And so I think it's something that behooves us all to have, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, a network of awareness where people can seek information and get it from either the blood or the plasma sector in a way that they're able to convey their goodwill and their blood and plasma to help other people, regardless of where it actually happens.
Great. Yeah, really interesting. Paul, I'm particularly interested in your experience here, what you're doing to deal with the barriers and retain, recruit those, especially those from underserved communities.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. And so first, I think the underserved communities are a real significant issue. As I mentioned before, we are actually collecting fewer post-pandemic than we were before, and we're putting in a tremendous amount of effort, right? Which is, I think, the only answer, to the problem. What I was going to say is, but it's understandable why we're seeing the challenge, right? Back to Curt's comment about convenience, which I agree with. The challenge is, at least for us, and I think it is extrapolatable to the rest of the industry, is we saw a massive change, right, to where we would see our donors. We saw a significant decline in our corporate collections, for obvious reasons. People are working from home. Our education segment is dramatically reduced. It's starting to come back, but it's still smaller post-pandemic. And those were places where we did, on a relative basis of where we would find different donors from different ethnic backgrounds, we saw a disproportionate, certainly in the education segment in particular. And so we're needing to find ways to, I think, build stronger relationships with that community. I liked what Dr. Delaney was referencing in terms of, really establishing reciprocal relationships. That's something at the Red Cross we've really been trying to stress. So examples include, we have a sickle cell initiative focused on the Black community, where we're trying to build strong relationships with different education groups, HBCUs, fraternities, sororities, but really just building stronger networks across our national system to make sure that we can re-invite and make good options available to African-American donors so that we can have a better supply of those products for CEK patients, sickle cell patients. Similarly, we're doing the same thing with Latino donors, right? It's actually not obviously just unique to African-American donors. So we're working on a significant initiative in that area. The other thing we're really trying to do is, again, think about from a broad standpoint, and this is why I think, one of the trumps before we joined today was about the nonprofit versus for-profit sector. I think part of the value of the not-for-profit sector is a mission focused, right? Curt referenced earlier, reinvesting in donor recruitment. I think that's huge. Part of that also is investing in those communities, right? We do see health disparities across the United States in pretty profound ways. One of the things the Red Cross is trying to do is build areas of focus of communities that are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. We're trying to build a more reciprocal relationship with blood donor groups in terms of how we share back information in their own well-being and health. Really trying to think about what is the right value proposition for donors to build an ongoing relationship with the Red Cross. Just a couple other things to build on the comments. I liked what Curt also referenced again regarding convenience and time. We see that we survey, obviously every donor, so 5 million plus donors every year, and the overwhelming sentiment is, or the biggest correlation between their satisfaction in the donation process is how much time it takes them. Literally minute by minute, we see the shorter the donation throughput time, the better the satisfaction to our donors. So, clearly, again, convenience and being out in the community matters. We're trying to build on, if you will, that ease and convenience through other ways. We're looking at, a non-invasive hemoglobin hematocrit test. Some blood centers already do that. Just again, things that make it a little less intimidating, a little simpler. The final thing I was just going to add to Josh's comments about, what triggers donors, and most importantly, and good news for America, is when you survey donors about why they donate, it is altruistic far and away, right? I mean, they may care about convenience, but why they're doing it is trying to help other people. That's heartwarming. Sometimes it can be troubling to see, though, what triggers that action. And I don't mean troubling in a bad way. I just mean we've just recently had one of the most successful promotions that we've had, which was a Snoopy t-shirt. And it was beautiful. You know, it was give blood, be cool. And it was Snoopy leaning against the Red Cross. I highlight that, though, because part of what was just interesting, kind of funny about that is we saw that go viral with young donors, literally millions and millions of TikTok references to the Snoopy t-shirt. And what I thought was funny about it is often it was tied to things like the needle stick wasn't so bad, maybe I'll do it again. I mean, it was, you know, it was just kind of interesting, you know, and I think that gets to kind of, again, the heart of blood donation, right, is people want to help other people. You know, again, if you look at the numbers, you know, if you ask people across America, how, you know, are you a blood donor? Something like 45% will say, yes, I'm a blood donor, but yet we only see 3 or 4% every year, right? And I assume a lot of that is you gave one time back in high school or college, and you always intend to come back. So again, a big part of this is how do you, again, to Curt's comment, make it convenient, but also how do you trigger that action? And just it's both interesting and I think worthy of further research is, again, how do you trigger that action, whether it's a Snoopy t-shirt that kind of catches the imagination of folks, or more fundamental things, which is, you know, how do we build a reciprocal relationship with communities of color in a meaningful way that actually helps them beyond just, if you will, kind of helping the blood centers and what our short-term needs are for particular products.
Fascinating.
Yeah, this is super interesting, and a lot of what was said sort of motivates my next question. So as was mentioned, so the industry has a mix of non-profit and for-profit entities, and donors have different donors have different types of motivation. Some donors are purely altruistic. Other donors must receive compensation, perhaps because of, you know, the time commitment that's implied in donating, or, you know, to overcome the fear of needles. So let me just make a little bit of an introduction to my question. So in the distant past, right, the demand for blood was predominantly driven by emergencies, accidents, and traumas. Now the community, small communities, the community was the primary source of aid, often responding very rapidly in the wake of emergencies, rallying together, right, to donate much needed blood to those in need. This was a purely altruistic, selfless exchange rooted in a system based on reciprocity, community, and altruism. And the system worked effectively within the confines of closely knit communities, right, and small-scale emergencies, local health crises. Today, however, the landscape of blood demand, as was mentioned, is very different. The need for blood goes way beyond emergencies. We said, you know, surgeries, cancer treatments, chronic illnesses. That much of the demand for blood is related to those more routine treatments. Furthermore, there have been changes in society when more and more people are living in large cities with the weakening of the traditional sense of local community. And so that, I imagine, has also posed challenges to the blood supply system. So the question arises, I'm getting to the question, if a system that relies on pure altruism can continue to sustain the current magnitude of the demand for whole blood, like given the scale of the need, should we consider incorporating more sort of market mechanisms into the blood supply chain? Like this shift could include incentivizing blood donors or commercializing more the process, in contrast with the current system that has traditionally relied on altruism, right? Or perhaps altruism and incentives are not incompatible. For example, firefighters get paid, but we still see them as selfless heroes who, you know, are willing to get in harm's way to help protect the community. So with all this introduction, I'd love to hear our panelists' thoughts about whether you believe that our current system based on altruism can sustain this growing demand for blood, or do we need to explore more market-based solutions similar to what happens from what I understand, in the plasma industry to address these growing needs. Who wants to go first?
I'll take a stab. I think there's a false dichotomy sometimes, or a false choice posed, where it's either an altruistic donation or it's a mercenary collection, and one is paid and one is not. And maybe you can imagine that at the far end of the tails of the distribution of the population, there are persons like that. No matter what, I'm going to donate freely under any circumstances, and there is no way I'll donate unless you pay me adequately. Those are the two extremes. We guesstimate that those two extremes in the adult population is less than 10% in total. Okay, so that's our back of the napkin guess on how large a portion that is. So the question isn't really about what are those tails of the distribution. The question's about what's all that in the middle. All the 90% of the persons who are in the middle of that distribution, what do they want? And we consider the donation an experience. And people want different things in their experiences in life. And we recognize the unique values people have, and what they do enjoy and what they don't enjoy in the blood donation experience. And part of that is they may need to get a little compensation. And part of that is they may need a little more convenience, or they may need something special in the experience, like something notable pop culture, like a Snoopy t-shirt that goes viral, whatever the case. And personally, I think that the industry has devolved to simplistic thinking around it's either altruistic or it's mercenary. And frankly, I think that's actually not the right question. The question is, what's going on with the bulk of the population, and how do we actually understand their preferences for the donation experience and design the experiences that they want, akin to the design of, say, going to the movies. There's lots of different kinds of movie experiences you can enjoy, from an IMAX to your local theater. So those have been designed. Can we similarly approach the bulk of the population with that level of sophistication? And the industry simply has not done that, at least on the, I should exclude the plasma sector because I don't know the answer to that, but at least on the case of the nonprofit collectors in the US, I don't believe the industry has done that adequately.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Meghan?
Yeah, sure. I completely agree with what Curt said about the edges, and then in the middle. And I can relate two quick, very different stories as to tell you, where I am in my thinking about this, and where people come and how they interact with the donation event. So at Children's National, one day we might be a little low on platelets, and a mom might be standing next to her child's bed, and the nurse comes in and says, your platelets for your child today are going to be a little late. The blood bank's a little low. That mom goes, I'm going to go donate downstairs, right? So they're donating for the child in the bed. That's what they're thinking. But then they realize, hey, I'm going to organize a blood drive. I'm going to get my whole family to come in and donate. So some people, is that volunteer? What is that, right? So that's one story. And we love those moms because those families come back, and then they might say, well, we don't really live in the area, but when we go back home, we're going to donate to our center there. So it's that hook. And of course, that was a personal motivation at the beginning. And then I want to totally switch. As the people on the panel know, I do global health work. I just returned from Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, where I was doing transfusion medicine system development. And they work with there's a big push. WHO wants volunteer, non-remunerated donors. But a lot of the low and middle income countries in our world have the more subsistence type of replacement donation. So if a child comes in with malaria and gets a transfusion, that parent or the family needs to come replace the unit in the blood bank, and they might just have a few. Does that sound a lot different? Do you see what I mean? I mean, in many ways, it's similar. Now, it's harder. They're really sort of battling as best they can the culture to get that replacement donor. Now the real focus is we're trying to help them. Let's convert that replacement donor into a volunteer donor. And again, it's like it gets very gray. And so, and I do think that also the Malawian blood transfusion service, they had these t-shirts, I donated 30 times. And then that person wears that t-shirt around their town. And that was an altruistic donation. Who knows why they did the first one, but now they've donated voluntarily. And just like the Snoopy t-shirt is a badge of honor and a badge of altruism, I think people want others to know that they made the donation. So I think we just need to keep working at this and not make it a dichotomy, just like Curt said.
Thank you, Meghan. Paul?
I fundamentally agree, right? It's I think that's what I was trying to get to is in my comments earlier. I think it's thinking about what triggers someone to action, and rarely is it a straightforward financial calculation for folks. It is things like, Dr. Delaney was just highlighting. People are always proud, you give someone a sticker saying I donated today, they'll wear that all day, and the rest of the time, obviously we can't, throw that stuff away fast enough, right? It gets to kind of, again, the heart of it. People do it for altruistic reasons, and they want other people to be able to understand that, or they want to signal that. I think the other just kind of interesting fact, right, in the U.S. is there have been for-profit efforts, paid donation programs, and there I think are a couple underway again now. They haven't been particularly successful. Whether that's again, they just haven't figured out the right remuneration effort, or again, it's kind of not about the money in totality. I think it's one question. Excuse me. And then the other thing is, I think this is true, Josh, is right. You folks saw a real, at times, decline during COVID of your donors, and it's interesting, right? The quote unquote paid program. Now, Josh already said, right? It's less sometimes about the pay, and so they're working on other ways to partner with donors. But it is interesting that I think they saw a bigger decline during the pandemic, and so it does get to, again, a pretty delicate balance in terms of what you're bringing forward, from accessibility to access to, just basic education of why it's important, versus just straight compensation. And I don't think straight compensation, it may help trigger someone to action at some level, but I doubt it carries the day in general.
Thank you, Paul. Josh?
Yeah, I have to agree with what everybody said here. I think that this is kind of a common sense recognition of the complexity of the human experience. And, we have plenty, our member companies have plenty of experience where, a donor will come in the first time because, this is the way to get some money. College student needs money for the weekend, whatever you want to call it, but then they keep coming back after the weekend. Because if the center is doing an okay job of educating the donor and telling them about the importance of their donation, the people that it helps, the conditions which are treated by plasma protein therapies, it gives the donor an added incentive to donate that isn't monetary. They recognize the necessity and importance of it overall. And I think that it's understanding, comprehending, and indeed embracing kind of the diversity of the human experience in terms of what motivates people and what they want to be a part of. First step is always, and I think Curt mentioned this at the outset, is kind of removing barriers to people donating, and then making it convenient. And Paul, I have to say, I don't know if you noticed this, but I was nodding vigorously whenever you were talking about the finger stick. Donors hate that. That's worse for them than the needle in the arm. So it's little things like that can help people come back to make it a more pleasant and satisfying experience for them, along with the knowledge that they've helped somebody, and also gotten some monetary recognition as well. So there's no magic bullet. It's a complex area, as complex as the human animal is. So I don't know that anybody's ever going to find the perfect combination to unlock that door, but what you can do is you can get closer and you can score more people. Whether you're going to score enough of them to overcome their fear of needles or not, I don't know. But hopefully, there are some that will be like, I can deal with this enough because I know it helps people. I know I'm going to get this out of it. It's going to make me feel better, et cetera, and so on.
Just the remuneration that some people get for giving create a part of their living wage ever? Is there any data on these?
Kathy, I'm sorry, you were, I don't know about
Yeah.
anybody else, but I had some distortion whenever you were asking that question.
Yeah, I was wondering if those who get remuneration, if there's any data about whether they need whether they're using the remuneration as part of their living wage, basically.
There's no question that people do use it as a way of supplementing their lifestyle, supplementing their household income. Depends on where they are in life. You know, certainly the prototypical donor is the plasma donor is the college student who comes in and studies and donates plasma at the time. But you know, the stories that I have heard, and these are of course are all anecdotal, but once you heard 1,000 of them, that's more than anecdote. You know, somebody saving up for a gift for a relative, somebody saving up for a vacation, somebody saving up to pay extra bills, to complement the household income overall, to, you know, have a date night or something like that. So it really runs the spectrum of what somebody would experience. You know, there was a study, Mario, I think you know this well. Gallagher was one of the researchers on it. Emily Gallagher. It was a couple of finance academics that looked at the inculcation of economic benefit into the community in which a plasma center is located, and it is significant. And they also kind of traced a lot of the discretionary income that donors used. And the other flip side to that, Kathy, is that what they found, I believe I'm recalling this correctly, is that the money is being spent back into the community as well. So, you know, having a local donor at a local center, patronizing local businesses and helping other members of their community is kind of this ongoing virtuous cycle that we're seeing.
Yeah, interesting.
This is super interesting, and I have the feeling that we might need a part 2 to continue this conversation. Because I'm looking at the clock, we only have 6 minutes left. I want to read a question from a member of the audience, because it's important for us to address their questions. So this person asks, do you think autotransfusion would solve the blood supply problem, especially as it relates to trauma patients? And I would like to expand on this question a little bit. To what extent, you know, new technologies, recent advances, like, you know, we hear about synthetic blood, to what extent those new technologies can really be a substitute in the near or maybe very distant future, and so that, you know, we would no longer need so much sort of you know, from human donors. So two separate questions, but looking at the future, autotransfusion, especially as it relates to trauma patients, and new technologies, you know, that might produce substitutes for human blood.
You want me to take that? I can probably.
Please.
Yeah, so autotransfusion is certainly a valuable tool. You know, we call these a cell saver. Machine suctions the blood as you're doing the surgery, and it's cleaned and washed in a bucket kind of automatically, and then you can give it back. It's put back in a bag, and then you can give it back. It can help with surgical bleeding. You know, it won't help with a cancer patient, something like that, who's anemic for other reasons. And it's not indicated for certain types of medical situations when they think the patient has an infection, because there could be a bacteria in the blood, but it absolutely is a tool. Does it solve, you know, there's no magic bullet to solve blood shortages. You know, there's like all these different things we've been talking about. And moving on to blood substitutes, such a cool idea. And my whole career, I've watched this and paid attention to where we are. The story in the 90s was the hemoglobin replacements, or HBOX. They got pulled from the market, even from trials, because they were harming patients. And so the scientists are still toiling away. Now the focus tends to be more on blood stem cells and sort of creating bags of blood by growing them in a vat. I'm very much simplifying it. And we are not. So it's happening, and there's research happening. There's actually some really cool stuff that's coming out. I will just tell you that something like, anecdotally, when we've seen presentations, a bag of reticulocytes, which are like baby red cells, can cost like $250,000 or something right now. So it's not there yet, but remember the human genome, the first time we sequenced the human genome, and how many years it took and how many millions of dollars. And now my lab in my hospital can do a genome in 2 days. So someday, but not yet. So it's not the answer around the corner, but, you know, I have to believe someday science will get this more cost efficient and feasible and safe.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Are there any other thoughts on this from other members of the panel? Or if not, there's another question from the audience. It's a different spirit. Like, has the industry tried partnering with professional sports leagues or teams, I guess, in an effort to expand their donor base? Have there been any initiatives like that?
I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, you know, it gets back to affinity. You know, I think someone is referencing, you know, almost, you know, kind of local. Red Cross, we do an annual promotion with the NFL, and it gives us tremendous lift every January around the Super Bowl. We do a partnership with Major League Baseball in the All-Star game, and then a number with local teams and minor league teams, right? I think it gets to, again, people like to affiliate, you know, it's almost like whatever the right term is, but, you know, just again, affiliate with different groups. And certainly sport teams are a powerful cultural identity in many locations and then across the country. And so, again, I think it gets back to what triggers someone to donate to. I think, you know, a raffle to go to the Super Bowl is driving fundamental changes in the market now. But for a NFL fan, you know, with an aspirational moment of being able to attend the Super Bowl, even if the odds are very low, I think, you know, it's a fun partnership. It catches people's attention, and I know many blood banks across the country have partnerships in similar ways with their local sports teams. Yep, makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Josh. Were you getting? What did you want to add anything?
We have had those, our industry has off and on. A number of years ago, Abbott had a big partnership with Cristiano Ronaldo, who's probably, if not one of the top 3 most recognized athletes in the world. And it was about blood donation and then by extension plasma donation as well. Paul had mentioned earlier some of the activities that occurred with COVID. There were a number of celebrities that were involved with that. The Rock, for example, Tom Hanks, I believe, was another one. So yeah, there have been a lot of these efforts too.
So there's finally, the last minute we have, there's a final question from a member of the audience, which I think is a good way to end this conversation. And love to hear our panelists' reactions to this. Is there any focus on education on the next generation to try and build a stronger donor base in the future? What are your thoughts on that? What is being done?
I suspect that every blood center in the country, whether it's a regional blood center or whether it's a national entity like the American Red Cross, does education. And what we know is that the human's desire to help another human hasn't declined over the years. We don't see any evidence that folks are less altruistic today than they used to be. But what we also know is that it takes time, and sometimes it takes multiple touches, sometimes personal conversations, to convince somebody to donate blood for the first time. And to go all the way back to where we started today, the reality is that's really expensive. And we took a donor base that used to be this big, and it's now this big. And in order to regenerate that donor base to the size we need to create a bigger buffer than we have today and grow as the needs for blood grow, that's actually pouring resources into education in a variety of different forms. And until we handle the economics of the industry such that there's adequate resources going into that, we'll continue to see really difficult moments where there's not enough blood in the blood bank and a mom has to go downstairs to donate for their child. And that's probably not, for me at least, the standard I'd like to see in the nation. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, I do think we have a major economic problem. I don't actually think we have an altruism problem.
Meghan, Paul, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, the question about education, I couldn't agree more. To talk to young people, to put it in the STEM curriculum, and many blood centers and hospitals do things like that. And so, absolutely, for sure. But I agree very much with Curt about the financial system. You know, we need to be investing, the blood centers need to be investing in donating, in engaging blood donors of all the different age strata and different cultural and ancestral groups. And then I do think that another thing that shouldn't be ignored is that the hospitals, you know, right now the hospitals in America are not doing well. They took a major hit as well with COVID. Salaries are very high, and you know, and there's just a lot of disconnect in how a hospital's budget comes together. And the reimbursement for blood is pretty static, and it costs a lot to even, you know, it costs a lot to produce the unit, what the blood centers are doing. And then it costs a lot for the hospital to safely transfuse that patient. And so I think we need to have a national conversation for that whole value chain to true up the expenditures with what is paid back.
Josh, Paul, is there anything you wanted to add? If not,
I mean, education is extremely critical. It's hard to disagree with that. So, and it takes an ongoing sustained effort day in, day out over the course of weeks, months, years, decades in order to do that.
I also think too, you know, and it's had to be very adapt, you know, now hospitals, blood centers have social media people, right? That wasn't the case 10 years ago, that they had people who knew how to do the socials, and now they do. So it's a moving target about how to engage. And sometimes you get great hits like the Snoopy t-shirt, which was just a sensation. I'm so excited to see that. But we don't, you know, you invest a lot of money to be able to get people to hear the message in the way that they'll receive it.
all right, that was great. We're out of time. So thank you, Kathy, for co-organizing and co-hosting this with me. And especially thank you again to our panelists, Curt, Josh, Meghan, Paul. It was a very, very informative conversation. And thank you to our audience. This was our last HPHI webinar for this 2022-2023 academic year. We're planning our webinars for after the summer. Information about our future webinars will be shown on the HPHI website, and there you can also find recordings of our past webinars. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.